For this seminar, we wanted to present a topic that contributed to the growing but still underrepresented attention drawn to the discipline of classics' historic entanglement with projects of empire and their legacies. For our seminar, Out of the Shadows of Empire, we invited scholars from around the world to speak to some of the diverse ways in which subaltern writers and creators have subversively redeployed Greco-Roman culture to critique these systems of empire and Euro-American cultural dominance and deconstruct the colonial apparatus. Today's talk is the second out of 6 seminars following last week's discussion of the Bacchae and the post-colonial turn during the 1960s and 80s by Professor Patrice Rankin.
Today, we are thrilled to welcome Lesego Chauke, a doctoral researcher, theatre maker, and lecturer at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Lesego is a PhD fellow of the Reimagining Tragedy from Africa in the Global South initiative, led by Professor Mark Fleischman and Mandla Mbothwe of the University of Cape Town's Centre for Theatre, Dance and Performance, which over the last 5 years has been, I'd say, at the forefront of creating new African tragedies inspired by ancient Greek tragedy and epic. As a RETAG scholar, Lesego has worked on the significance of the chorus in contemporary South African adaptations of classical Greek tragedy, and her doctoral research focuses, if I may paraphrase, on the poetics of ancestral communion in contemporary South African performance making. Her essay, Live and Proclaim, Mourning as Resistance in the Context of Pervasive Death in Mark Fleischman's Antigone, Not Quite / Quiet, won the Helsinki Prize at the International Federation of Theatre Research in 2023, and which I've had the pleasure of hearing her deliver as a presentation before, so I can guarantee you're in for a treat. Her presentation today will be on Choral Poetics, Beyond Tragedy Towards Mourning, A Glimpse of Utopia, and we greatly look forward to hearing what I'm sure will be another fascinating presentation. So over to you, Lesego.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you, Daniel and Leo, for the invitation. I hope we're going to have a good discussion after all this. So as Leo sort of mentioned, I arrive at classics through theatre and performance. So I'm in no way a classics scholar, but I do engage tangentially in various ways with the concept of tragedy. And what I'm going to present today, in response to Leo and Daniel's provocation, is fragments from what is my bigger thesis project that try to contextualize the notion of tragedy and empire, but in South Africa, and try to center the contemporary politics of South Africa. And hopefully, that'll yield something interesting that we can talk more about as we go forward. Thank you again. It's called Choral Poetics, Beyond Tragedy Towards Mourning, A Glimpse of Utopia. Now, insofar as we might understand tragedy as a particular mimetic framework, I undertake to name what is tragic in contemporary South African life, and then to mobilize the mimetic faculty as that which can reinforce or disrupt what is tragic in this context. I'm interested in looking beyond the archive towards history. What I'm attempting to highlight is history's debt to mimesis. What I'm hoping becomes clear through the discussion is that history becomes such through mimesis, but that this relationship is not linear. That somewhere in this delicate dance between mimesis and alterity exists an utopian imaginary that makes possible, even as it troubles history. As Michael Talsig puts it in his discussion of Theodore Adorno and Walter Benjamin, Adorno writes that Benjamin is driven not merely to awaken congealed life in petrified objects, as in allegory, but also to scrutinize living things so that they present themselves as being ancient, ahistorical, and abruptly release their significance. I'm interested in how the concept of archive might complicate and enrich our understanding and discussion of the classic, the contemporary, and the power dynamics therein in the South African context. My broader doctoral project locates at its center and at the center of tragedy more broadly, the notion of chorus. Understanding that most tragic scholarship, beginning with and continuing from Aristotle's Poetics, engages tangentially at best with the concept of chorus, my own approach, in its consciousness of its Africanness, takes this dearth as its point of departure. Here, we are not concerned with tragic heroes or fatal flaws. Ours is a meditation on chorality. It is a shared view among tragic scholars, at least of Western and Greek tragedy, that, and I quote, "The ancient chorus is difficult to define and even harder to stage. The little that we know about the chorus comes from Plato and later Aristotle, who did not spare much room for it in his Poetics. The whole matter was made even harder by the fact that we do not have a single tragedy from the 6th century that could lead us to the beginning and further development of the chorus itself. Our entire impression and comprehension of the chorus is based on knowing 3 of the greatest poets of tragedy from the 5th century." End quote. As a result, my orientation to chorus in this study is based on the one hand in performance, as in the live moment of present encounter, and on the other hand, in the local context of contemporary South Africa. I want to note here Albert Wiener's argument that, and I quote, "the characters, in that they imitate the plot, are the very soul of tragedy, and this soul is eternal, for it exists whether we read or see it on stage. The chorus, on the other hand, is a purely theatrical element, and it exists only in the theater. We must see the chorus dance and hear it sing, or it does not exist." Despite the Aristotelian slant in Wiener's argument, I find myself drawn to the idea that the chorus does not and cannot exist beyond the stage. On paper, the chorus reads as little more than a single character who enjoys referring to himself in the plural, not unlike the use of the proverbial we deployed in much academic writing. Furthermore, the overall heightened language of dialogue in classical texts makes it nearly impossible to distinguish what is sung from what is spoken. Thus, Aristotle's contention that the chorus functions as a single character, much as it is clearly an afterthought in the grand scheme of the Poetics, proves apt when tragic dramaturgy is considered as a textual enterprise. My own approach to tragedy is somewhat anti-Aristotle. I'm going to put a little block on that. We'll discuss it a little further as we chat. In fact, I adopt a decidedly Nietzschean point of view that not only foregrounds the ritual foundations of tragedy, but also expounds on the notion of Dionysian excess. While I give credence to Nietzsche's theory that tragedy is the marriage between the opposing attitudes of Apollo and Dionysus, at stake for me is not so much this binary as it is the potential implied in thinking of the characters as Apollonian and the chorus as Dionysian, as distinct entities with a distinct function, but each being an integral part of the whole production. I acknowledge at the outset that the Apollonian characters, the tragic heroes as it were, have received substantial attention in much historical analysis of tragedy, and the present study is not wholly excluded from this tradition. But my primary focus in what follows will be on the Dionysian chorus. And there are multiple reasons for this approach, not least of which is the fact that my key case studies are performed adaptations of Greek tragedies and not just textual adaptations. Furthermore, the performances in question mobilize chorality in notable aesthetic and political ways. That is to say that within these works, the chorus does not act as a conciliating influence between character and audience, as has been previously argued. Instead, the choral function as a technique is given renewed significance. In these works, the chorus emerges variously as a single character made up of multiple bodies, as in Antigone Not Quite Quiet, as a collective of individuals with their own identities and stories, as in Oedipus at Colonus, #after Sophocles, and even as spirits from another realm who exist simultaneously as apparitions to the characters and as real bodies on stage to the audience, as in Ikhelele. Another reason that chorus is central to my thesis is the way in which it acts as a representation of community, not any single community in particular, but as a prism through which to agitate the very concept of community. That suffering sits at the heart of tragedy cannot be overstated, and what I'm interested in is how an individual's suffering reveals the greater afflictions of a community at large. In another counter-Aristotelian slant, I turn my attention in this study from the causal relationship between the tragic hero's choices and his suffering towards the relationship between suffering and circumstance. Here, we are not interested in how an individual's hamasha brings about their peripeteia. Instead, we ask what socio-political conditions make possible, even lead to, a community member's suffering. Further still, we ponder on the affect and effect of that suffering on the community through questions of civic responsibility, causality, citizenship and liberty, civic and otherwise. Here, South Africa's dynamic socio-political history serves as a rich context in which these concepts may be troubled. And particularly urgent in this discussion is the social and political function of death in the formation of nationalist identity. Whew. While the study is primarily concerned with tragedy in performance, I do not limit my definition of performance to drama and theater. Rather, I lend the word performance to a range of scenarios in which action, witnessing, articulation, and embodiment meet. These moments include, but are not limited to, political protest gatherings, cultural events, and even public and private moments of identity formation. In this way, theater or performance combines with theory to forge an assemblage of images of the repressed aspects of experience. This encourages us to make the most of the shared root of theory and theater from the Hellenic theasemai, to behold, as though asking that the pitfalls of the deceptive plots of sophistry be heeded and simultaneously exceeded. My goal here in centering the chorus is to re-enchant our contemporary experience of tragic performance, as well as, and perhaps more importantly, to reinvigorate performance as a mirror to society. Much tragic scholarship asserts affect, an affected audience, as central to the reception of tragedy, be it Aristotelian pity and fear or Nietzschean intoxication. Tragedy is tragic because it moves the audience in a particular way. My argument is that contemporary society, in the immediate context of South Africa, but also beyond, has become desensitized to any one individual's suffering. In the same breath, we are acutely attentive to causality, which possibly makes us uniquely amenable to affect and, more importantly, to empathetic affect. Consequently, the historical emphasis on the tragic hero falls short of the task of tragedy today, and the shift in focus towards the chorus renews our ability to see ourselves as also always at risk of being befallen by similar suffering. In undoing apartheid, excuse me, I'm just going to hit the light. Please give me 1 second. It's getting quite dark. Sorry about that. Undoing apartheid. Oh, there we go. In Undoing Apartheid, Pramesh Lalu argues for the necessity to re-enchant the desire for post-apartheid freedom. Lalu distinguishes between grand and petty apartheid, arguing that while grand apartheid may have been overcome by the advent of democracy in 1994, The urgent task for the post-apartheid subject is in overcoming the more insidious aspects of our oppression, petty apartheid. Lalu writes that at its most basic, petty apartheid was distinguished from grand apartheid's social engineering by the way it set to work on affecting relations of sense and perception in everyday life. Much of my study takes this very idea as its premise and attempts to grapple with what it means to exist as supposedly free subjects in the post-apartheid context. Furthermore, I take as my point of departure the aftermath of this petty apartheid by focusing on relations of sense and perception in everyday life. That is, a decisive turn away from apartheid's grand injustices towards the more quotidian and significantly longer-lasting repercussions of petty apartheid. Historically, the nature of suffering under colonialism and more recently and specifically under apartheid has been represented somewhat mythically, framing transgressors as heroes and martyrs while negating the heroism of everyday survival. The struggle has become something of a mythology, and the theatrical works and concepts that are mobilized in this study seek to undo this mythologizing by, and I quote, affirming theater as a site for making history rather than functioning as a ruse for talking about history. Here, we consider the productivity of the medium of theatricality in assembling fragments of images to craft a sense of freedom in a world where the lessons of tragedy have been replaced with myth. Lalu understands tragedy and by extension theatricality as a productive means of aesthetic education. In this feat, he invokes various case studies from ancient Greek texts as well as contemporary South African performances to mark apartheid's performativity as a stalled dialectic of a master plan and a street plan. Excuse me. Here he calls to Walter Benjamin's Trauerspiel, literally mourning play, in which tragedy's redemptive ends are displaced by the most banal and ridiculous expressions of heroism, redeployed in the chaotic onset of an uncertain modernity. Lalu, drawing from and citing Elizabeth Stewart, charts out the difference between tragedy and the Trauerspiel as follows, and I quote, the Trauerspiel, naively thinking of itself as restoring tragedy, actually perverts and dislocates it. Instead of a trial ending in a decision and sentencing as happens in tragedy, the Trauerspiel presents courts where no decision can be made because everyone and everything is equally fallen, equally guilty, equally doomed to a hollow grave. Instead of the decisive Oedipal action that characterizes tragedy, here we have mainly chaotic schemes, machinations, and deals. End quote. Lalu's suggestion that apartheid may be read as a Trauerspiel is particularly compelling in the context of the study, firstly in the way that it introduces the concept of mourning, as in mourning play, and secondly, in the way that it sets the groundwork for reading the aftermath of apartheid as Trauerspiel as well. George Steiner, in the introduction to Benjamin's The Origin of German Tragic Drama, summarizes the difference between tragedy and Trauerspiel quite elegantly. He writes, and I'm going to quote at length, Tragödie and Trauerspiel are radically distinct in metaphysical foundation and executive genre. Tragedy is grounded in myth. It acts out a rite of heroic sacrifice. In its fulfillment of this sacrificial, transcendent design, tragedy endows the hero with the realization that he is ethically in advance of the gods, that his sufferance of good and evil, of fortune and desolation, has projected him into a category beyond the comprehension of the essentially innocent, though materially omnipotent deities. The Trauerspiel, on the contrary, is not rooted in myth, but in history. Historicity, with every implication of political, social texture and reference, generates both content and style. Feeling himself dragged towards the abyss of damnation, a damnation registered in a profoundly carnal sense, the Baroque dramatist, allegorist, historiographer, and the personages he animates cling fervently to the world. The Trauerspiel is counter-transcendental. It celebrates the immanence of existence, even where this existence is passed in torment. It is emphatically mundane, earthbound, corporeal. It is not the tragic hero who occupies the center of the stage, but the Janus-faced composite of tyrant and martyr, the sovereign who incarnates the mystery of absolute will and of its victim who is so often himself, end quote. It is fair to say that the performance works that the present study engages fall comfortably under the category of Trauerspiel. And this is both true of form and content. Furthermore, fundamental to my own definition of tragedy is the idea of mourning. Here, mourning is not simply something done by characters in a tragic performance. Mourning becomes an orientation toward and away from history. It comes to name the complex relationship between making history and being in history. And while it welcomes an audience in this endeavor, it is never really primarily intended for one. As Steiner notes, these antinomies of transcendence and immanence, of myth and history, of heroism and tyranny or martyrdom, of silence and loquacity, lead Benjamin to his fundamental distinction between tragedy and trauer. Tragic feelings, in the sense assigned to them by Aristotle's Poetics and Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, are experienced by the spectator. They refine, enrich, and bring into tense equilibrium the inchoate muddle or incipience of the spectator's emotions. But fundamentally, tragedy does not require an audience. Its space is inwardness, and the viewer aimed at is the hidden God. Trauer, on the other hand, signifies sorrow, lament, and the ceremonies and memorabilia of grief. Lament and ceremony demand audience. Literally and in spirit, the Trauerspiel is a play of sorrow, a playing at and displaying of human wretchedness. Spiel compounds, as it does in its English equivalent, the two meanings of game and stage performance, the ludic and the mimetic histrionic. Tragedy posits an aesthetic of reticence. The sorrow play is emphatically ostentatious, gestural, and hyperbolic. It identifies the earth with the stage in the notion of the theatrum mundi, a conceit to which Shakespeare gives local stress when he plays on the word globe. It sees in historical events, in architecture, in the collateral edifice of the human body and of the body politic, properties for a grievous pageant. Now, the particular dramaturgy that the study engages, that is a dramaturgy of mourning, is implied in Benjamin through Steiner as characterization of the difference between tragedy and the mourning play. While the idiosyncrasies of the differences are decidedly inconsequential to me, I'm particularly interested in the orientation of tragic history towards and or away from the audience, as Steiner describes above. To think of mourning as a dramaturgical strategy is to trouble the foundational ideas around audiencing, witnessing, seeing, and being seen. At its root, the dramaturgy of mourning seeks to agitate the notion of subjectivity, to ask who, what, when, how, and why subjectivity is materialized and mobilized in, through, and beyond performance. It is interesting to me that, as rife as death and violence are in classical Greek tragedy, the performance thereof traditionally happened on stage, or off stage. This becomes even more interesting when we consider the relationship between violence and or death and state formation as outlined by Benjamin in the origin of German tragic drama and René Girard in Violence and the Sacred. For both, the state's authority is inextricably linked to its ability to exact righteous violence and death. In Critique of Violence, Benjamin distinguishes between two types of violence, the mythic and the divine. Mythic violence, that is, the projections of authority, identity, and nature that determine and control our lives both collectively and individually, is notably different from divine violence, that which is undertaken by God and, in a sense, realer than anything human beings say or do. In Benjamin's view, and I quote, "The state in particular is a promulgator of mythic violence. In its anxiety to promote an image of power and authority that has no actual ontological basis, the state engages in various forms of violence, both literal and metaphorical, to assert the fact of and its right to its existence. It engages in violence on the living and the dead in order to establish its jurisdiction and power." The case of contemporary South Africa is particularly interesting here because, on the one hand, of the state's failure to retain control over violence, and on the other hand, because of a shift in emphasis from a primary concern with the power and violence of the state to a more general, if no less political, concern with the social and political violence more generally. Of the relationship between history and tragedy, Atto Quayson writes that the perceived relationship between tragedy and the historical phases of its emergence has been ever thorny, as is the question of whether it is a product of a particular epoch or exclusively of individual acts of writing. What I am proposing is that tragedy may be considered as patterns of representation that emerge in response to historical moments of crisis. A society in crisis will inevitably seek out various ways to articulate and make sense of that crisis to varying ends. And these various attempts might interact in ways that may be read as a sort of poetics, a systematic program of representational strategies that is constituted by and dialectically constitutes history. According to Mbembe, and I quote, "No archive can be the depository of an entire history of a society, of all that has happened in that society. Through archived documents, we are presented with pieces of time to be assembled, fragments of life to be placed in order, one after the other, in an attempt to formulate a story that acquires its coherence through the ability to craft links between the beginning and end." For Mbembe, the archive necessarily appropriates temporality in a way that renders history vulnerable to present perception. He argues that the community of time, the feeling according to which we would all be heirs to a time over which we might exercise the rights of collective ownership, this is the imaginary that the archive seeks to disseminate. If we take up this idea, then the archive emerges as a state apparatus curated to serve the ends and narrative of the state. For our discussion, state can be read to mean any kind of hegemonic institution or hegemony, theater being an example here. In Theater History and the Ideology of the Aesthetic, Professor of Theater in English Joseph Roach suggests that, and I quote, "Such miniaturized rituals of subjection as the theater affords might conveniently advertise the regularities of ever larger orders," end quote. This, he writes, to destabilize the presumption that the aesthetic exists as an autonomous category transcending the sublunary sphere of power relations and ideologies. This relationship between the aesthetic and ideology seems to reinforce Mbembe's understanding of the archive, provided that we take up the implied congruency of archive and aesthetic. To engage meaningfully with the archive, therefore, one must begin from the basic understanding that it does not represent a singular, solid, or even complete story, and that it is not absent of or beyond rules of form. Mario Tello's 2020 Archive Feelings, A Theory of Greek Tragedy, proves quite instructive in not only affirming Mbembe here, but also in exploring the complex relationship between archive or archiving and tragedy. Tello, who is primarily concerned in this book with outlining an anti-cathartic reading of Greek tragedy, offers a rich survey of literature on the subject while also mobilizing key concepts and terminology from psychoanalysis and philosophy to articulate and rehearse a new methodology for reading tragedy in the contemporary context. His description of the critical intention of his book is pertinent here, not only in the way that it refers back to Mbembe, but also in the way that it describes my own reading of the dramaturgical approaches that I engage with in my study. He writes, I seek to delineate affective atmospheres where worlds, with their formal features and characters' psychic orientations act together. Acceleration, hoarding, vertiginous suspension, breathless looping, affective bulimia or binge eating, serial cutting, trying to enter or fold into oneself, autoimmune inflammation, the orgasm as an unfinished, non-teleological pleasure. These are the intimations of aesthetic experiences that I use to articulate my model of anti-catharsis. I regard these aesthetic potentialities as archive feelings because they all arise from the effort to recapture a phantasmatic arche that directly or indirectly points to the ultimate origin, not existence. I'm particularly excited by Tello's use of bodily functions to express his methodology because it preempts the embodied dramaturgy and hyperphysicality that is present in the works I discuss. In a way, it frames the archive following Mbembe not only as material, but further still as corporeal. Again, I quote Mbembe here, who writes that it may be that historiography and the very possibility of a political community, a polis, are only conceivable on condition that the spectre, which has been brought back to life in this way, should remain silent, should accept that from now on, he may only speak through another, or be represented by some sign or object which, not belonging to anyone in particular, now belongs to all. The archival enterprise is fundamentally concerned with fragments, remnants, debris. Part of the process of engaging an archive meaningfully is disrupting its assumed wholeness. Dismemberment is a necessary part of assembly. The parts must come to signify something significant beyond the whole, the assumed whole, and so too must the range of new assemblages. As Mbembe puts it, following tracks, putting back together scraps and debris and reassembling remains is to be implicated in a ritual which results in the resuscitation of life, in bringing back the dead by reintegrating them in the cycle of time in such a way that they find in a text, in an artifact, or in a monument, a place to inhabit from where they may continue to express themselves. What we are ultimately engaged with here is not simply the resurrection of ancient texts and forgotten characters. It is something bigger and urgently present. It is a process of writing specters, living specters, into present time. And in doing this, it is wholly aware of the deadness of the subjects to whom it gives voice. Taking up Mbembe and Tello's provocations here, both the Antigone Not Quite Quiet and Oedipus Colonist productions do not resist the reality of social death so much as take it as their point of departure. As Tello puts it, the backward gaze toward an origin, which, according to Jacques Derrida, animates yet troubles any archive, can be seen as an expression of the classic Freudian register of the death drive, an impulse in the human psyche to return to a lost state of repose, non-existence, the primal arche. Much writing exists on the complex relationship between the written and the embodied archive, most notably the work of Diana Taylor and Judith Butler, amongst others. But at stake here is not just the written word read against corporeal textuality, what might be called representationability. Instead, what is being agitated is the limits of death on representation and finding signification in what remains. It is not just the living body's ability to represent that is being highlighted, but that of the dead body as well. The corpse emerges as possessing equal, perhaps even exceeding, political agency. And this raises interesting questions about tragedy and its portrayal and relationship to power and violence. This type of performance work, as James R. Martell puts it, is about allowing death to shatter the assumptions of the living, about fighting the projections that dominate us while we are alive, projections of safety, order, sovereignty, and the like, via the way the dead body reveals the failure of those projections. That both tragedy and utopia are fundamentally concerned with human suffering is undeniable. They are both, in my view, techniques for articulating the experience of suffering, as well as attempting to imagine something beyond that suffering. In the introductory chapter to her doctoral thesis, titled Pairing Tragedy and Utopia, Ramona Francisca Moss argues that at the intersection of tragedy and utopia lies the complex relationship between violence and its representation. And this in some ways calls back to René Girard in Violence and the Sacred, and even Walter Benjamin in Trauspiel. But if we take seriously the idea that to count as a utopia, an imaginary place must be an expression of desire. To count as a dystopia, it must be an expression of fear. Then violence can be seen as the mediator in this continuum. Open quote. The variety of responses raised in the 1960s debate about the death of tragedy can be grouped into three alternative models that speak to what constitutes tragic conflict. Helpful in this context is Hans-Thies Lehrmann's categorization of theories of tragedy in the conflictual model based on Hegel and the transgressive model drawing on Nietzsche. What Lehrmann does not include is a third alternative, which I would like to term the revolutionary model, linking to Raymond Williams's ideas. The revolutionary model distinguishes itself from the transgressive model insofar as it considers the moment of excess to be inherently political. Suffering per se, then, is an expression of injustice, albeit a political, not an ontological one. The possibility of destruction is not amplified by the embrace of annihilation. In its place, it offers a space for reimagination. What is significant here is that within the revolutionary model of tragedy, aestheticism itself comes into focus, more so than the ethical struggle it attempts to depict and to deal with. There is an inherent disparity between displays of violence and performance and the experience thereof in our everyday reality. While apparent and physical acts of violence are rife in classical and contemporary tragedies, the far more insidious, far more affective moments of violence are not so prevalent. What is significant right now also, and Moss articulates it rather elegantly, I quote, "By foregrounding the parameters of representation, particularly with regards to the violence at its core, tragedy redefines its political dimension. In the struggle between the repeatable and the unrepeatable on stage, tragedy asks us about the shifting aims of the representational process. In a sense, the ethics are recovered through the aesthetics. For through its particular relationship to violence, tragedy inquires into the implications of its aesthetic repeatability. The banality of violence leads us back to an ethics of aesthetics that replaces the mere opposition between the two. If tragedy was ailing for lack of an external ethical force, it also does not remain enriched in a purely aesthetic context, mostly because the violence that is the climax and product of the conflict ceases to be anything but a banal figuration of signs. Tragedy is in need of a counterpoint that can draw out its revolutionary dimension. End quote. While not so much a counterpoint, I believe that Utopia has the potential to draw out the revolutionary dimension of tragedy. Moss argues that Utopia claims to have found a way of solving the tension between the greater community and its individual members. It thus should make tragedy redundant. Moss's premise here is productive, though the conclusion is reductive to a fault. Because tragedy is not disharmony between a community and its members. In her own formulation, tragedy arises when suffering disrupts the functioning of a community. Give me 1 second, I need to just go back there. In her own formulation, tragedy arises when suffering disrupts the functioning of a community. Further still, tragedy often leads to the formation of new communities and the transformation of existing community, and even the formation of community anew. In Moss's own words, the violence at the heart of the tragic story marks the incommensurability of an unjust social system and suggests the possibility of change. Tragedy becomes something of a precondition for utopia. Its violence is the defining moment of the society described. Moss maps out a teleological relationship between tragedy and utopia, in which tragedy, a catastrophic moment, gives rise to utopia, the image of a better alternative rooted in futurity. Consequently, utopia, always being susceptible to further tragedy, runs the risk constantly of slipping into dystopia once confronted with new tragedy. It is important to note here that Moss's temporal understanding of tragedy comes down to a moment of catastrophe, while my own conception takes the afterwardness of catastrophe as its point of departure. While I agree with Moss that tragedy depicts the breakdown we cannot bear to see, utopia glimpses a political community we cannot yet imagine. My contention is that an orientation toward tragedy as something protracted, rather than as a fixed moment with a clear duration, shifts the focus away from the breakdown towards the we that cannot bear to see. And it is this we, or the sense of the we, that I want to engage here as I conclude. In my view, chorality is a foundational aspect of performance. Performance in all its permutations always entails a joining of multiple forces, be it aesthetic forces in the form of collaborators, narrative and stylistic forces. Performances always involve individual parts coming together to render something beyond each of those parts. Furthermore, chorality can be understood as the highest expression of performance's transformative potential, because in the death of the individual parts, the new whole is able to be birthed. As Tunstall writes, in every transformation, something dies and something is reborn. If we take up this premise, then chorality is that delicate and ever elusive space, that utopian imaginary through which the acceptance of death invites birth. In this way, the choral reveals itself as inherently utopic. Thank you very much.